Hey guys, Chris at the Ultimate Recycler. Here's my old Stihl chainsaw. And what's a chainsaw got to do with recycling, you might say? Well, like everything, if you maintain it and look after it, any sort of equipment, from your car to your chainsaw to your tools, if you look after anything, you're going to get a nice long life out of it. And surely that's good for the environment to use something for a long time rather than buy cheap units, don't look after them, throw them away, buy another one. We're becoming a very wasteful world. Now this old chainsaw is about 20 years old. I've had it for about 10 probably. I bought it off a guy, actually it came from a deceased estate, and the guy used to be a firewood cutter. It's a 60cc, fairly powerful saw, probably a semi-professional model, would have cost the bloke probably about $1,000 back 20 years ago. Really nice saw to use, and it's still in really good condition. So this video really just concerns a little bit of maintenance. I thought I might share a few tips on looking after your chainsaw. I don't cut very much wood anymore. In fact, I haven't used this saw for about 5 years until last week. I dragged it out from under the bench, fresh fuel, couple of pulls, away it went, performed beautifully. So there's a couple of tricks to be able to do that with your small engines, and I thought I might run through a few things on this saw now. So if you're an experienced chainsaw user, you're probably going to know most of this, but you might pick up a couple of tips. By all means, comment underneath if you think I've forgotten something. If you haven't had much to do with chainsaws or two-stroke engines in general, hopefully you learn something from this. And it's really just a matter of a few basics. We won't be too complicated, and it's just a matter of looking after your equipment and making sure, you know, if you put it away for a few years, it's going to start perfectly next time you want to use it. So as I mentioned, I did use this saw just last week. I cut up some sleepers for the garden, a bit of red gum. It cut through really nice. The chain's getting a bit worn and it probably needs a sharpen now, and we'll touch on maintenance of the chain and the bar as well. It's still quite dirty. I haven't cleaned it off because I actually do have to cut a bit more timber for a garden job at my daughter's place this week. So that's really all the saw gets these days, is the odd garden landscaping job, or perhaps a branch has come off a tree, but I don't go and cut firewood with it anymore. But what we'll do, we'll start with taking the bar and chain off it, and we'll have a look at the power head and just go through some maintenance issues with it and what to look for and how to best store your chainsaw if you're not going to use it for a while. And then we'll put the chain and bar back on. We'll have a look at the sprocket, and we'll just go through a few tips with that. So to take the bar and chain off any of these saws, there's usually a couple of nuts, or sometimes just one on the cheaper saws. They vary in size. The Stihl ones are nearly always a 19mm, or around about 3/4 inch. I don't have the exact saw toolkit with this, but if you use the right size socket, it's good, and it'll undo nicely. I'll do that in a second. Don't use a shifter or an ill-fitting spanner, or even the right size ring spanner. If it's not offset enough, you'll find that it won't get a good bite on the nut and you'll end up rounding the corners off. So always use the manufacturer's tool or the right size socket. Okay, as you can see, it's very dirty there. I'm not going to encourage people to polish up their saw or whatever their engine is after every use. You don't have to have it looking like it belongs in a museum or the showroom of a retail outlet. But there's certain areas that you do need to clean, and it's easy just to scrape the old sawdust off here. Now, because the chainsaw actually oils, because the chain running around the bar needs lubrication, and there's a little oil channel here. Most chainsaws are pretty much the same. You really want to make sure that's nice and clear for the oil to get through into the bar, and we'll look at the bar later. But because it does oil, the sawdust, of course, soaks up the oil, and you end up with this sort of messy, dirty, it's almost like mud, but it does get rather oily, and of course it sticks everywhere, so it does need cleaning out regularly. But really this doesn't have to be spotless. The area you want to keep clean mainly is where the oil comes through, where the bar sits up against the housing, where the chain adjuster is, and the corresponding parts on this side. The rest of it really isn't that important, but it's a good idea to scrape it off and clean it off. You could use an air compressor. I'm just going to wipe this out with a rag now and get it a bit cleaner. There we go. That's got all the most of the muck off there. As I said, you don't need to go any cleaner than that unless you're a bit OCD and you want to wash it all in with petrol and blow it off with the compressed air. It's really not necessary, because the first time you use it, it's going to be all clogged up with oily sawdust again. But as I said, you do need to get the sprocket area clean. Make sure it spins nicely on the clutch. Make sure there's nothing fouling the bar adjuster, which on the Stihl models works on a little right angle drive. So you actually put the screwdriver in through the clutch cover and adjust the bar tension that way. Most other chainsaw brands have a screw coming in from the front, so you'll need to make sure that's clear if that's the case. So whilst we've got this off, let's have a quick look at the sprocket. The sprocket runs around a clutch. It's a centrifugal clutch, so as the engine revs pick up, it engages behind in the drum, and it drives this sprocket forward, which in turn drives the chain. So that's the way it drives, but it needs to be free. They run on a little needle roller bearing, and it gets oiled as well from the chain and bar oil. So that's all good. It's accessible via a little circlip here on the end. Now this sprocket itself looks pretty good. It's not overly worn. When they wear, you see a section in the middle on each tooth that actually pushes on the drive links of the chain, and it does wear into the sprocket, and I've seen them where they've actually worn right through and cut the sprocket in half. So that's really just poor maintenance. People need to check them regularly. Usually if you're putting a new chain on your saw and the sprocket shows any wear, that's the time to replace the sprocket as well, because if you put a new chain on a badly worn sprocket, it will prematurely stretch the links of the chain. Now, they do make a rim system sprocket, which I prefer to these. These are called a Spur Sprocket, and the rim system ones have the clutch drum the same, but they have a little spline that comes out this way, and then there's a rim that goes on the spline, and it can track in and out on the spline, and it lines up the chain with the bar really well. The good thing about those is when the rim wears, you just take the rim off and put a new rim on. It's much easier to replace rather than replacing the whole clutch drum. But anyway, this one's in good order, and the amount of work I give this, it's going to last me a long, long time. So that section's okay. Let's look at the rest of the power head as far as the engine goes and discuss a few maintenance things. Now, underneath the main cover here, there's an air filter, and you can see it needs a clean now. I'll take that off and give it a clean, and I'll show you how I clean that. It's worth sometimes just using some compressed air and blowing a bit of the dust out from around the carby, because you don't want dust getting into the engine. Don't blow compressed air directly onto these type of air filters, and if you do take the filter off to wash it and then hit the thing with compressed air, make sure you cover the throat of the carby, otherwise you're going to get blowing dust down into the engine. So we'll take that filter off now. This one just requires a screwdriver, a couple of large screws. Okay, these there's a lot of different sorts of air filters that chainsaws use, or two-stroke motors in general use. Some of them are a pleated paper type. Some of them are just a very fine, sort of a plastic gauze mesh. These ones, I think, are probably a better quality filter in that they're like a flocking, sort of a fabric type material. And they do catch, as you can see there, they do catch the dust very well and prevent it from going in. Now look, it's really nice and clean in there. And if we look in the throat of the carby there, it looks pretty clean as well. Now if we close the choke, which operates that way, that will help prevent a lot of the dust getting in. But I'm actually going to hold a rag over the end while I blow a bit of that out with the compressed air. And these air filters on the still are good in that they can draw air in from both sides, so you get good airflow into the engine. They usually do pop apart, and it looks like the corner here. Now, I haven't actually done this air filter before. As I said, I've owned this saw about 10 years, but I've only used it a couple of times. I really only kept it because it was a good chance to keep a good saw for future work. I was never planning on going out and getting firewood. So consequently, the only real small amount of work I've done with it, I've never had to give it a bit of a service, so now's a good time. So you can see there that the filter's working well. It's in good condition. There's no holes. There's no evidence of any dirt getting inside. So now that we've got that apart, I'll just get a bit of two-stroke fuel and show you how I clean these. Okay, a bit of two-stroke fuel. It will wash off the muck from the outside of the filter just with a paintbrush. A soft brush anyway, you don't want a stiff bristled brush because it could damage the filter. And the good thing about using two-stroke fuel is that it will dissolve any oily stuff on the filter as well and clean it up. But it will also leave, when we finish, it will leave a nice film, a very thin film of oil as the fuel evaporates on the filter, which is the best way to stop it catching more dust, or stop letting dust through. The oiliness of the flocking will capture dust beautifully and stop it all getting into the engine. Now you do have to let these dry, because if you went to start this chainsaw with this soaked in petrol, you're going to pretty well flood the thing. So there we go, that's cleaned it up well. It'll dry fine, and we will very, very carefully blow some air through it just to remove, just to make sure it's nice and clean, and any of there might have been a bit of residual sawdust in there. We'll gently blow some air through it from a long way away. I recommend never putting compressed air through these, but from a fair distance you just get a little bit of airflow and it helps clean them out. Okay, I've just blown the air filter out very gently, as you saw. You seriously can damage these filters very quickly if you hit them really up close with your air compressor. So be gentle with that. I just like to do it because it helps it dry and just blows some of the just last remaining sawdust off. Now we'll just clean around the carby, and I've just got a little bit of a rag here. We've got the choke closed, but this will stop any dust getting into the carby. I've actually turned my compressor off, and the air pressure isn't huge, but it'll just clean it up a little bit. There we go. Now you certainly don't need to be spotlessly clean again in here, as I said before. It's really just a matter of getting any muck out that's likely to foul any linkages or to work its way into the carby somehow. But that's all pretty good. Nice and clean there. I've also cleaned around the spark plug, because we're going to take that out and have a look in a minute, and we don't want any dirt to fall into that spark plug hole and into the cylinder. So big part of maintenance, of course, is to keeping your engine nice and clean and not allowing any foreign materials to get in there and prematurely wear it out. So we've done the air filter. Let's have a look at the spark plug while we're here. Now the boots can take a little bit to come out sometimes. This one's not too bad, and they're a 19mm or 3/4 plug on most small engines, and you've got to use a deep long reach socket or a spark plug socket if you don't have the original tool. So usually one bit of a quick jar and they loosen up. I should probably come out with my fingers now. If ever you have a spark plug that's really tight and really hard to move, you want to get probably a bit of lube down on the threads, so move it as much as it will. Get some spray down there, work it in and out. If you force them, they will actually strip the thread out of the head, and you've pretty well then got a major repair on your hands. Now let's have a look at this plug. Hopefully you can zoom in there all right. This one looks pretty clean. There's not an overly large amount of carbon there. It's a little bit damp and a little bit of carbon, but then I only ran it for a short time. It certainly didn't get hot, But that plug looks pretty good. The electrode doesn't appear to be burnt away or anything. The gap looks good. Now, just on the gap itself, most small engines are around about 20 to 25 thou. I'm not sure, that's thousandths of an inch. I'm not exactly sure what that is in mil. But as a rough guide, a hacksaw blade is usually pretty accurate. So you don't have to have a feeler gauge. If your gap there is about what you can just slide a hacksaw blade through, you're going to be pretty close, so that'll work fine. Now, this is a projected nose plug. A lot of the early engines, particularly 4-strokes, like lawnmower engines, used to use, the Champion one was a CJ8. This is a NGK plug. I'm not sure of the corresponding number. But a lot of the chainsaws and more modern engines, and when I say modern, after 1980 onwards, they went to the projected nose plugs, and they do perform a lot better in these, especially in the high revving chainsaws. So it's a good idea to check that you do have the right plug, and if you've got a manual for your saw, or I'm sure you could Google it, because the type of plug does make a big difference to how easy they are to start and how they run. And of course, you don't want to just put any old plug in, because some of them are actually different lengths. And if you put a long reach plug into a short reach hole, you'll end up punching a hole through the top of the piston or all sorts of other worries. And if you need a long reach plug and you put a short one in, well, you'll find that the threads in the cylinder head will start to clag up with deposits, and then when you go to put the right size plug in, you won't be able to get it in. Causes all sorts of problems, as well as firing and starting problems. So really important to get the right plug. That one looks great. If it was running very rich, you'd get a lot of black carbon deposits around the electrode, and likewise if your saw or your engine's running too lean and too hot, the plugs get more of a whitish look to them. So you can tell a lot from how the plug appears. That one looks good. Now, if you're ever testing the spark on an engine, it's a matter of putting the plug back in there, of course. Now, a lot of them you don't actually have a lot of access to the metal. This one has got a plastic shroud, but for us to see a spark, we'd have to pull the cord, and we'd need that body of the plug to earth. I'm not sure if I can actually do this with a screwdriver here. I think I can. Rest it on the cylinder head, rest the plug on the screwdriver, and if we have the stop switch off, we should actually get a spark there. Yep, I could see a spark. I'm not sure if you guys did. I didn't need to test it because the saw is running well, but if you do test the spark on your plug, you obviously have to earth the housing of the plug into the cylinder. Alright, so everything looks great there. We'll put that back in. Don't think it even needs a clean. And you don't want to over tighten the plug either. You just do it up to its firm with your fingers, and then the socket back on there, and you just nip it up so it's firm. You don't want to over tighten it, because as I said, the cylinder head is an alloy and the threads can strip fairly easily. Okay, that part of the saw is good. Our carbie's all done, cleaned up around it. We won't go into tuning a chainsaw at this stage. If you'd like to find out details on tuning, we can perhaps do that in another video. Our air filter's good, nice and clean now, clipped back together, so we can reassemble that. And that pretty well takes care of this part of the saw. I mentioned about starting this saw after sitting for nearly 5 years. Now, most of you won't have that situation. Most of you would, if you own a chainsaw, you'd use it relatively regularly. If you get firewood, you'd use it quite a lot, perhaps not over summer. If you have one just for the odd gardening job, it might go for quite a while without being used. Now, the secret to be able to start it easily after sitting for a while is to tip the fuel out. So let's tip the fuel out now. Here's the fuel cap on this side. We'll open this up and we'll pour it. I'll try and get it this side, and we'll pour whatever fuel is in there into this container. Now, it's quite clean because I only put fresh fuel in the other day. But the point of doing this is that a really large percentage of two-stroke problems, starting problems, relate to stale fuel, stale petrol, stale gas for you guys in the States. What happens with two-stroke fuel is that it loses its volatility. What happens, the petrol part, the volatile part, evaporates off, and you get a larger and larger concentration of oil. It becomes eventually, if I let that sit for a couple of days, it would end up with an oily film on the base of the plastic, and the rest of it would have evaporated off. And that's what can happen in your saw. So if you're not going to use your saw or your two-stroke mower or your brush cutter or anything that runs off two-stroke fuel, even an outboard motor, if you're not going to use it for, say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks or longer, tip the fuel out, empty the tank. And then what I'd recommend you do is put the cap back on, I won't do it tonight, but take the thing outside, start it up, it'll run for a minute or two, it'll cough and splatter, it'll run out of fuel. And what that will do is it'll empty the fuel out of all the fuel lines, it'll empty the carby, and it'll leave everything nice and spotless and clean inside, and you won't get any residual fuel sitting, and the oily sort of deposits then block up all the fine holes and channels in the carby, and it just causes a lot of grief. So unless you're going to use your engine fairly soon or regularly, tip the fuel out. That's still very, very good fuel. I could put that back in my fuel container for next time, or I could use it for washing up parts or something else. But the point is, if I leave it in the fuel tank, it's going to go stale, and stale fuel is the biggest issue with starting problems on two-strokes. So that's one of the reasons I was able to start this saw after about 5 years. I didn't realise I was going to leave it for 5 years. If I had have known I wasn't going to use the thing for 5 years, I probably would have put a little bit of two-stroke oil down the plug hole and just spun it over a couple of times just to lubricate everything, give it all the good soaking of oil inside. It would mean that when I do start the thing up for the first time, it'd blow a bit of blue smoke, but that would clear. But the point is that you can get damp air in through the air filter and in through the carby if it's in a shed that can get damp, depending on your environment you live in. You can also get air travel in through the muffler, and that'll go directly into the cylinder, and you do not want damp air in an engine for a prolonged amount of time. So if you're not going to use your engine for a long time, prime it with a bit of oil. But if you're going to use it, maybe a month, 6 weeks, couple of months, drain the fuel out of it, and then run it until it runs out in the carby. And that's one of the big things that'll help you start it great next time. So our fuel's good. There is a fuel filter in there. I didn't show you that. Chainsaws, because they're used on different angles, you can use them upside down, you can use them on the side if you're cutting a tree, or you can use them virtually up this way if you're cutting a high branch. The fuel pickup line in the tank, there's a little filter with a weight on it, and it hangs into the tank. So if you change the angle of the tank, it hangs to the lowest part. I can't quite get it out with my finger. You kind of need a bit of wire to hook it out. Rarely you need to clean the fuel filter. If you use clean fuel all the time, you really won't have a problem. If you have had a batch of bad fuel through, or fuel with a bit of water in that you didn't realise, you might want to hook it out. And they're various. A lot of them just use a felt type material, and you can blow them out with the air compressor. Incidentally, if you do get a little bit of water in your petrol in anything, a small amount of metho will help absorb it, and it won't then sit in your tank. It's fine on these tanks, they're plastic, but on a metal tank, say in a motorbike or something, it can actually rust. But it will help the engine consume the oil, a little bit of metho. All right, so that's the petrol or the gas, and that's the biggest trick I've got to be able to have a good starting unit down the track. The only other thing we've got to look at is you don't want a lot of muck building up in here, because these are an air-cooled engine, and most small engines are air-cooled. They don't have a radiator, they don't have water to keep the cylinder cool. You do need good airflow, and if this clogs up with sawdust or dry grass or something, or leaves, it's going to reduce the amount of air flowing through the fins. The flywheel not only carries the magnets for ignition, but it does have fins which actually act like a fan, and they blow air through the engine. So I'll blow some compressed air through that just to make sure it's clear. I could take the cover off. It's probably good practice every so often to take the cover off. The starter rope, it's always worth checking the pull cord to make sure it's not worn. Often they will wear through the eyelet where you pull them. Particularly I notice on some lawnmowers, because you tend to pull the same angle all the time, it rubs and you can actually get a sharp patch and it'll cut the cord. So that's just, maintenance, just have a bit of a glance at that. I would recommend probably pulling this cover off every so often and just cleaning out all around the flywheel fins to help with your airflow. So that's pretty well done for the maintenance, except the muffler. Now this is the other end of the engine. We had the fuel and the air going in, and your exhaust fumes come out. A lot of them have a fine screen in here, and I don't know if you can see in that far. I might have to take it off. They've got a fine mesh screen which is like a spark arrestor. Now they can carbon up, and if it blocks off or partially blocks your exhaust flow, you'll severely inhibit the engine from running. Generally it happens if you're using stale fuel, or if you're using fuel that has a bit much oil in it. You create a lot more carbon, and it can certainly block up that screen. I know a lot of guys will actually take that screen out, but they are there for a reason, and you don't want sparks flying out. If you have a little bit of carbon in there that comes loose and happens to be a spark, you don't want to start a fire out in the bush. So the recommendation is to leave the spark arrestor screen in there, but you do have to clean it occasionally. You also find trouble sometimes in storage, not so much with chainsaws, but I found it a lot with brush cutters, whereas they have a muffler with a little round outlet, and mud wasps love to build nests in them, and if it blocks up your exhaust with mud, you're not going to be able to start the engine. Okay, we're done. The engine's been checked over. We need to check the chain brake operation. Since about the 1980s sometime, might have even been late 70s, the chain brakes become a legal requirement, and what it does, for those of you who don't know, is this is turning your chain. If the saw kicks back at you, which can be a dangerous situation, you don't want it flying back at you at 1,000,000 miles an hour with the chain actually running. What will happen is that your hand will hit this as the saw comes back at you. It will knock that lever forward, and you heard the click, and it operates a band around the outside of the clutch, and it stops it instantly. That's now lock solid. So yeah, sure, the chainsaw might still come back and hit you, but at least the chain won't be spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It should have stopped instantly. So you need to check the operation of that for safety's sake. And a lot of people, I think, even start their chainsaws with the chain brake on. I've never actually done that. I'm not sure what the actual recommendation is. Of course, if you have the chain brake on and you go to start the saw, it won't rev up. It'll load the clutch up. It'll idle, but it won't engage the clutch. So that was the last thing to check. So our saw has pretty well had a good health check. It's had a service. We've done the filter. We didn't do the fuel filter because I don't think it's necessary very often unless you're starting to have fuel problems. I will just blow that side out with compressed air. And the oil reservoir at the front here is that's where your chain and bar oil goes, which needs to lubricate the chain, as I mentioned earlier. And that's a similar sort of cap on this saw as what the fuel one is. Again, it has a pickup filter in there, I think. Or some of them run a pickup filter, some run a little pump that works off the back of the tank. I'm not sure on the design of this one. You shouldn't need to touch that at all, other than keep it topped up. And I'll do another video on tuning the saw and just checking how it's oiling. But all we need to do now is to look at the bar and the chain and reassemble it. Alright, so our chain. I won't talk too much about the chain. That's probably another video in itself. This one is down a bit. The teeth are probably nearly halfway worn, actually. Get that to focus properly. It's done a fair bit of work, this chain. It's the chain that was on the saw when I got it. It probably needs a little bit of a touch-up. We'll talk about the chain in another video. but it's still right to go for now. And the bar, I guess we'll discuss the chain and the bar in another video. It's probably easier because you need to look after these. It's been quite a long time since I've had my shop, but back in the 1990s it was around about $100 to replace, put a new chain and a bar and a sprocket on a saw. It no doubt would be a lot more expensive now. Depends of course on the size of the bar and how many drive links you've got in your chain. So we'll do another video on these at some stage. But as far as just general maintenance goes, you do need to run a cleaner around the bottom of the bar just to make sure there's no build-up of oily sawdust that stops oil flow. And I'm just using the broken hacksaw blade here. You can buy little tools. And I mentioned the oiler, where it oils out of this little channel, and that lines up with a little hole in the bar here. Now you can see it there, that little one there, and it's a bit clogged up. I need to actually clean that one out, because that gets the oil from the chainsaw into the side of the bar there, which then goes into the bottom of the channel and it's carried round by the chain. So if that hole is blocked, your chain's not going to get oil, and it relies on it oils at the top. I'll just hook this up now, put that in there where it goes, and this, I'll just move the camera down. Now there's a hole the other side there that lines up with that channel we looked at, and the oil goes into the bar and the chain's traveling this direction, so the chain helps carry the oil right around the top here, around the end, does a quick loop around the end. There's a sprocket on the end of this bar. Some bars don't have sprockets on the end. It requires some lubrication as well, and then the oil has to travel all the way back here along inside that groove, and it's most needed in this section where the bar is resting on the log and the chain's actually doing the cutting. So that goes away to explaining why you need to buy a bar and chain oil. And if you ever get some bar and chain oil on your fingers and pull your fingers apart like this, it leaves little strands, almost like mozzarella cheese. Not quite as thick, but it's sticky, and it needs to be sticky. If you use just normal engine oil in here, it will oil the top of your bar right, but you don't really need the oil there. And what will happen, because the chain goes around this corner at some incredible speed, all the engine oil is going to flick off the end and none will get back to where it's needed. So that's the reason why you need to buy chain and bar oil. The other thing is, I once had a customer in my shop skite that he was saving money on oil because he was using his old sump oil, engine sump oil, in his chainsaw. He said, oh, it's oiling the chain. But what he was doing was, not only was he having engine oil that was flicking off the end, but it was dirty engine oil, so it was almost like a grinding paste. And consequently, he wore out bars and chains very quickly, so he wasn't saving money at all. It was actually costing him money. So we need to make sure these holes are clear. You will find that there's a hole on this one too, because you can, oops, sorry, I've put the camera out of focus. You can turn the bar over the other way and see there's a hole on the bottom that lines up as well, because your bar does need to be rotated every so often so that you wear the rails evenly. So that's all that's involved with that. We will talk a bit more about the bar when I discuss sharpening the chain in another video down the track. We'll put the chain on now and we'll tension it up. Alright, you've got to make sure you have the cutters going the right way. They point that way because when they come back underneath, that's where it does the cutting. And if you have ever put a chain on backwards, you'll find you won't cut very much wood. It's interesting watching a couple of YouTube clips on people doing chainsaws, and you can tell the people that are just making it up, because a few of them put the chain on backwards and they didn't even realize. Okay, so that sits on there. We've got the locator down here. I'll bring the camera down and zoom in a bit from here if I can. There's the locator, which is your bar tensioner. So as we do up that screw, it moves that little peg that way, which pulls the whole bar out and tensions up the chain. Alright, so that's on there. We don't want to have it too tight, we just make sure it's all lined up properly before we put the outer cover on. Some chainsaws actually have the adjuster in the outer clutch cover, which makes them a bit awkward to hook up. So this one just has a flat surface, and we've cleaned it up well enough. So it's just a matter of locating that on there. We'll put the nuts on, and we'll just do them up finger tight. Like so. So the bar will still move a little bit up and down. Don't know if you can see that. That's just movement on the bar studs, the mounting studs. And what we need to do is tension the chain up so that it's pretty good, because I had it right tension before I took it apart. But what you want is, you don't want the chain to hang at the bottom. It needs to, if you pull it down so you can see the drive teeth, and you let it go, it'll spring back up and it'll be snug on the bottom of the bar. So if it's hanging down, it's way too loose. When it's snug, it should be good, but you should be able to move it by hand. Now, don't ever try to move it that way, because if you slip, those teeth are usually pretty sharp and they'll take chunks out of your fingers. Move it the way that it runs when the saw's running, and if your fingers slip, it won't actually cut. So that's pretty good. And sometimes you'll find that once you've used the saw for a little bit and it warms up, you might need to just tweak the tension a little bit more. And the last thing with tensioning is, we don't have to adjust that, as I said, it's pretty good, but we need to tighten up these bar nuts. And what you need to do with those is, when you're tightening, hold the tip of the bar up, because when you're cutting wood, the pressure is going to be forcing the bar up. If you tension it with the bar down, it just moves it a bit and it might throw your chain tension out. So by holding the bar up, I can tighten this, tighten the back one. I'm not doing them overly tight at this stage. And then what I generally do is, I just lean the saw forward so the pressure is on the end of it, and I can just nip them up a little bit more. But you don't want to do them too tight, because as with the spark plug, the threads go into aluminium, cast aluminium. In fact, I think it's a magnesium aluminium, and you can strip them. And if you strip your bar stud, then you've got to drill it out, retap it, or put it what they call a helicoil in. It becomes a big repair job. So never do over tighten nuts. They shouldn't work loose if they've nipped up firm. There we go, all good. It's tightened up, we've got good tension. It will still spin nicely, ready to go. We might give it a fire up tomorrow, and there you go. Maintenance complete on the chainsaw. I'll just put that air filter cover back on. We're finished. So I haven't polished it up, I haven't made it look magnificent. I've just got it cleaned enough that it's in good order. It's ready to go, ready to work another day. It'll start when I want it. It'll be reliable, and very happy with that. It's a great little saw, and it should have another 20 years left in it. We'll look at other aspects of chainsaws in another video down the track. I guess it depends how much you ask me to do it. Thanks guys. Catch you in another video. Bye.